Hello there. A few minutes late here. It just took Facebook a really long time to load this video. So thanks so much for joining me live on a Friday afternoon. My name is Julie Hirschberg. I am the founder, owner of Reactive Therapy and Wellness in the Los Angeles area. And I run our movement disorder fellowship program, which is called the Schmidt Movement Disorder Fellowship. Part of that means that we're learning a ton and we're sharing a ton of what we're learning, which is why I pop into here every Friday to chat with you all about what we're learning, what we're doing, and in particular to help people with neurologic disorders. We we had just the best course a couple of weekends ago, and I warned you I would might be talking about it for a few weeks. I'm still kind of running on a high. Mike Studer hosted the Neuropracticity 3.0 course for us, and then a free webinar just last weekend. By the way, you can catch that anytime. I'll put a link in here. Really great webinar, just free of Mike's great wisdom in the area of motor learning. And then I really wanted to share today one of the key areas from this neuroplasticity course that I really, really love, and I've been trying to incorporate more and more and really wrap my head around how to do this right. And it's called the method of amplification of error. And so what I want to do is talk about what that means. What is it? What the evidence says, who's the best person for this type of training, because it's not actually for everybody. It could make things worse, and give you some examples of how to incorporate this into treatment, because I've been using it a lot more since the course, since Mike's been talking about it with us for a couple of years, and I'm really surprised at how powerful this can be. So let's start first with what is it? This method of amplification of error, you'll often see it as MAE. What this is our knowledge and understanding that people can learn to correct their own movements by exploring their mistakes, exploring their errors, amplifying their errors, actually, that they can learn and improve their movement. And you might be like, why, right? Maybe actually, if you work in pediatrics, if you work with kids, this is not surprising, because we know when kids are learning skills like to walk, they fall a million times, right? So they have a lot of error in order to learn. It's part of our normal development. And in real life, and what we're training people to do, we know that we need variability. We know that we need to be able to change our movement patterns. And a lot of that comes from exploring errors that can occur. We also know that we're not designed to be perfect movers, right? Our brain is designed to take in a lot of variability and provide feedback. So we don't look for perfection, actually look for variability and having some of those errors. So that's really where this method comes from, is that knowing the science of people being able to learn through making errors. It's something when I was working with Dick Schmidt, actually, something that he was really excited about was this idea of dirty learning, but basically like that you would learn through making errors. And this holds up in the evidence quite a bit. Some of the evidence comes from sports. So we know there's been a few studies. Golf is a really big one. But there was a study, I can post some of the links in here for you too, a study looking at comparing this method of amplifying errors to just instructing, having a direct instruction in golfers. And the golfers were randomly assigned to these different groups. So amplifying error, having instruction, or just a control group. And they did pre-training, and then they trained, and then they did post-training, and then they did a retention 1 week later, and they looked at their kinematics with motion capture. And what they found is that when there was actually an amplification of errors for the golfers, they had much more rapid improvement in their performance. And isn't that what every golfer wants, right? So that was just one simple example from golfing. A lot of this started in the sports world, but of course, we picked it up in the neuro world as well. And there's a lot of great examples of this in the neuro world, especially in stroke and in fall prevention. So if you have been looking at some of this literature and finding interest in it, there's a lot looking at perturbation, specifically perturbating a surface so that it's like a slip or a trip. They typically do this on like a treadmill. This is how I've done it too. You know, if you're walking forward or walking backwards on a treadmill, and all of a sudden that treadmill switches direction, it's going to induce a little bit of a slip or a trip or an error, right? So this is a perturbation-based training, perturbation-based error that can occur. And then how do you respond to that, right? So there's been loads of studies looking at this in different groups, and that they found that as people experience these errors and perturbations, they improve their reactive balance control. This makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because you're specifically training that. There's one particular article, I'll drop this in right now. What I liked about this one, it's full text and it's free. It has a good visual of how they do this on the treadmill. So when I was first when Mike Studer was first sharing some of this literature, I was like, how is that actually done? He showed a lot of great videos in his course, but I also liked this visual in that article. So I just posted that in the comments there. So lots of good literature here. Really love this article by Marshall Crespo and colleagues. It's from 2017. Let me also give you this article, free full text. I looked at the effect of error augmentation as well using robotics. And what they found here, and this is really important because it gets us to who really is the best type for this training, is the training without the errors, without the perturbations, actually was good for people who were new to the skill, early learners, new skill. So that's really important. That early learner who needs a lot of success is probably not good for this method of amplification of error. What they also found in this study then is that the error amplification benefited people who were already more skilled. So we kind of see this continuum then. So that early learner needs more success, and then later to keep increasing the challenge, that later learner will actually need some of the error amplification. The random perturbation in this particular task improved learning and also promoted the transfer to other tasks. And what was really cool in this particular study is that they looked at fMRI to see some of the different areas that were being activated with this type of training so that we could see, to me, this is neuroplasticity come alive. We're trying to drive some of this. And this particular study looked at that basal ganglia, cerebellum, the intraparietal sulcus, the angular sulcus, or angular gyrus, excuse me, all were areas that showed stronger brain activation. especially with some of these random disturbances. So I think that's really interesting, kind of a fun way to challenge people too, to challenge them with random disturbances. And when they're asking you why, you can say, because now we're going to light up that basal ganglia more, the cerebellum more, and drive some of the motor learning. So this idea that of who it's best for, I mentioned early learners need that success. As their skill advances, though, the repetitions of the same old thing it's just not going to be enough. We need some constraints. We need perturbations. We need exaggerating that error. In order to improve their movement and their movement adaptability. And this really comes down to, if you're trying to decide who this might be best for, it comes down to a challenge point, right? So there's that well-known motor learning theory, challenge point theory, and it shows that learning is really maximized when the task difficulty is appropriate for the individual skill level. So that's where our skill as PTs, as OTs comes to play, is discerning where that challenge level is so that we can implement these ideas at the right point for people. So we might need to implement more success early on and then take it into inducing more errors. So when we think about, Mike actually had this really great slide in the neuroplasticity course that asks, like, when are we ready for these errors? So we want sufficient repetitions of success for that person. It's different person to person. It's not like the 10,000 reps for everybody. Having that knowledge that you could also go back to an easier level if it becomes too hard. And I think it's really nice to have objective measurements to determine where that is. I find, and Mike talks about this too, when we have a baseline level of the activity that we're consistently doing better than, so that we can start amplifying those errors and taking it the next step. Sometimes it's when we're around other people who are also making some of those errors, but still coming back. When we see other people around us, that can give us the confidence too. And then finally, when we have autonomy. Autonomy is such a big piece. This kind of brings in the optimal theory kind of overlaid with this method of amplification of error. So when we can layer on autonomy where the patient has full control, they decide when they're ready and the amount that they want to raise the bar up. Where the patient may provide permission. So we might say, okay, you've mastered that. Can I increase the difficulty? So they're giving you permission. Another way would be to do it in partnership. So what direction would you like to increase the difficulty, right? So speed, amplitude, weight, etc. We can change all of those things together. So that's kind of thinking about who this is best for, what the timing of it might be. Let's talk about some examples. So this actually, I want to give this example that was on Monday. So I was doing a co-treat with our amazing fellow, shout out to Ari, and working with one of her also amazing patients who has had some ataxia and sensory impairment, motor control issues post-stroke. He's been just hitting it out of the park, by the way. Progress in therapy, so great. So Ari and I talked about what I said is like, you want to try some amplification of errors here. You want to try some perturbations in order to drive more of that learning and recovery. He had a really good baseline. He's had some really great success. And I have to say, like, wow, I think Ari and I were really surprised at how powerful it was. So essentially, we set up a balanced task and gave some external focus. So we have an overhead like TRX type thing in the gym, we had some bands hanging down and they gave an external focus for the body position. So initially it was like, don't hit the bands. And then it was like, okay, we amplified the error. We said, now hit the bands even bigger, even more, move the band. So he was really overshooting the trunk position. And it was really hard on his balance. Then we brought it back. Okay, now are you ready? Do you want to try to not hit the bands? And he was like, oh, wow, it's a lot easier to not hit the bands now. So that's an example of basically working into that error. And he was amplifying the error. And then we could come back and try to have him control the trunk again, and he could do really well. It was really awesome. Let me give you a couple of other great examples that I loved from Mike's course. So sometimes what we see in a person after brain injury or stroke is that when they're walking, they might have some circumduction of their limb to advance it forward. So if we wanted to amplify that error, we one of the things that Mike has done, and I really love this, he put little cups on the side of the treadmill. He actually had the person get their leg out and kick those cups. So amplify the circumduction, make it worse. And then he has to bring them back down narrow. So then walking within a couple of lines, chalk lines on the treadmill. So amplifying the error and bringing it back. So that was another one of the examples that was really powerful from the course. One last example that could be really helpful in freezing, and I would have just never thought of this, is actually amplifying the freezing, amplifying the fascination. You could do this easily on the treadmill. So Mike had an example where he had lines really close together and the person had to take little shuffling steps. And then he had lines really far apart and they'd had to break out of that. So what the person can find is not only, okay, well, they get in the shuffling pattern, then they can break out of it and then they can get in it and out. And so it shows a lot of flexibility and variability. And what we know is that can actually help in their learning and training, being able to get through that narrower door. So you might actually, if somebody's having trouble freezing in a doorway, you might actually make the doorway more narrow. And amplify that error. Then have them go to a wide, then have them go narrow. So a lot of variability in the training when we're using the method of amplification of error. When I first saw this, I thought, why would I do that, right? And very much so, if the person's new at the skill and an early learner, you wouldn't want to do it. It would cause more errors. But as they progress and as they're moving in their recovery, you can actually do this and drive more recovery. I think it's really powerful. It's something I had not thought of before. And I've been trying it a bunch and been really pleasantly surprised. So that's the method of amplification of error. That is one of the key concepts from the neuroplasticity course that we had with Mike Stewart a couple weeks ago. I'll put a link to the free webinar. If you're interested in these pieces, that free webinar has a lot of great motor learning principles. One other thing that we did, and I'll put a link in it here too, is with that course, we created a pocket guide of optimal theory ideas. So external focus, autonomy, enhanced expectancies. We made that into a pocket guide that you can download, print it out, use it when you're feeling a little stuck, but want to take your practice, take the outcomes for the person that you're working with to the next level, incorporating those principles of the optimal theory into your practice. So we created that through the last 3 years of working with Mike and put all of those ideas into a pocket guide for you. And Kara notes too, like athletes overtraining for Olympic events. Yeah, so especially if they're overtraining with error. So it's a similar idea. And in fact, as I said, much of this much of the motor learning theories come out of sports. And then we go, oh, well, let's like apply this to everything, right? And now we're starting to see that in neurology, which is really cool. Um, yeah, that was a great observation. So anyway, you can download that pocket guide. We created that just to make this easier for you. And I'll put a link here as well for Mike's free webinar that we did last weekend. It was really awesome. Little over an hour of awesome material that you can get right there. So put those links in. Thank you so much for joining me today on a Friday to talk motor learning principles. And I will catch you again next week. Have a great weekend.